This episode is brought to you by Windrose Recovery, a family of premier addiction treatment programs in southeastern Wisconsin. Privately owned, Windrose Recovery offers a full continuum of personalized care for those struggling with addiction, including the Manor for residential treatment, Midwest Detox for inpatient detoxification, and Windrose Counseling for outpatient treatment. With highly personalized treatment focused on trauma, Dr. Chantal Thomas and her expert team offer an authentic experience, creating the kind of deep emotional change that's crucial for long-term recovery. If you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, call Windrose Recovery at 414-409-5300. You can learn more about Windrose Recovery by clicking the link in the show notes or by visiting windroserecovery.com. Thank you for listening to The Path to Authenticity. My name's Tom Gentry. I think of this show as the opposite of small talk. You'll hear real conversations with real people who know who they are. We talk about what makes them who they are, how they became who they are, and how we might become truer expressions of who we are.
This is Lucia Capacchione, and this is The Path to Authenticity.
Deep in the Santa Monica Mountains, her Escape Vortex offers a unique and truly fantastic setting for your next spiritual retreat. The Lavender Garden, the fire pit overlooking the Topanga Canyon sunset, and the Moroccan furnished yurt on this magical property provide the atmosphere for an inspiring and transformative experience. A sacred place ideal for yoga and wellness retreats as well as cleansing and healing ceremony of all kinds, Her Escape Vortex is part of a community of people eager for personal and spiritual growth. Visit thepathtooauthenticity.com/Her Escape Vortex or click on the link in the show notes for more information. If this is your first time here, thanks for checking it out. If not, thanks for coming back. I'm Tom Gentry, and this is The Path to Authenticity. Episode 142 for Tuesday, September 21st, 2021. This episode features the first of a two-part conversation with my friend, the author, Dr. Lucia Capacchione. And if you are familiar with the show, if you've been listening all along, this is actually from the first episode, which I feel like is as good as any episode I've done. She was such a great guest. She's a friend of the show. She's been on many times at this point. But I feel like now I have a fair number of new listeners who haven't heard this stuff. And on most of the podcast apps, the episodes where I feature Lucia can't be found anymore. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to go back, clean up the audio a little bit, and re-release it. These episodes, this one and the subsequent part 2 of this, were originally episodes 1 and 5. But Lucia was a perfect choice to be the first guest of this podcast. She's all about helping us be our authentic selves. She wrote the book Recovery of Your Inner Child, another book called The Power of Your Other Hand, and has written, I don't know, probably 30 books at this point. And she is the person who, when you hear people talk about inner child work, it's her work. And I've just been fortunate enough over the years to have become friends with her, take part in some of her workshops, bring her in to work with some of my clients, and we've maintained a friendship for 20 years. And when I first started thinking about doing this podcast, she was one of the first people I called. And from the get was very supportive. And she's led an exciting life. She talks about her experience working for Charles and Ray Eames in Los Angeles. And in part 2 of this, she gets into her work with the Imagineers at Disney, who she consulted with weekly for a decade to help them learn to nurture their creative inner children. And she's gone on to train lots and lots of people to do this kind of work. She's had a profound effect on my life. And I don't mean personally, I mean the work that she has done and how it has affected me and my personal healing. And it's just been a gift to have her in my life. So again, this was the first episode. I was still kind of learning how to use a microphone. I'm much better at sound editing now than I was then, and I have better equipment to record with, so the sound isn't as good as it would be if I recorded it today. So forgive the imperfections and enjoy my conversation with Lucia Capacchione. How are you?
I'm doing very, very well. I just had cataract surgery and I have new eyes, so that's really a gift. Great blessing.
So the colors are more vivid?
Oh, yes. Textures, colors, everything. It's just a whole new world. It's fabulous.
That's great. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for taking the time to do this with me. It's an honor, really, to talk to you. And, you know, your work has just affected so many people. And as we've prepared for this, just giving it thought, you know, I've been excited about it. And I've thought a lot about what I wanted to talk to you about. And just, you know, how common the term inner child is, how prevalent it is in the helping profession, and just to be able to talk to the person who kind of started that whole movement, I'm really, really happy about it. So if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about your childhood and what your family was like.
Well, my childhood really figured into, you know, what I became later, because I was very blessed to have a family who were very creative. My father was a film editor in Hollywood, and I was exposed at a very early age to some amazing talent. People like Judy Garland, and my father worked on movies with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly.
Oh my gosh.
So I got to go see those musicals, usually at the previews. They used to have sneak previews in those days.
Wow.
And I got to see them before they were released into theaters, and that was very exciting. And I also got taken on the set occasionally to see movies being shot and to be around the actual creative process, which is very different than what you see on the screen, of course.
I'm sure it is.
And of course, in that business, there are a lot of very creative people, and I observed at close hand how the inner child, the creative child, is expressed through the arts. And so that was a great gift for me to grow up with that.
Mm. So I'm assuming that when you were really young, you couldn't quite connect the dots, that's what it was, the inner child, that those are dots you connected later on.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And one of the things I noticed later on was that all of the great teachers and mentors that I had had very, very powerful and very spontaneous inner child energy. And that was what drew me to them. And I didn't realize that in my first career as an artist and designer until I got into psychology later on, which was my third career. But my second career was child development. And it is no accident that I was drawn into that work and getting training in Montessori and eventually becoming a Head Start director, that was drawing me to the spirit of the inner child because the children were still in their child state. So that made a lot of sense to me years later, why I was so drawn to that.
So can we go back a little bit and talk about your artistic career? And specifically, I've always found it really fascinating that you got to work with Charles and Ray Eames. Right.
Well, let's go back to the beginnings of my art career. Happened when I was ill. I had pneumonia when I was 9 years old. And I had a very severe case of it, and I also had side effects to the penicillin they gave me. So I was in bed for a very long time in the winter of that year. And one of my girlfriend's mothers gave me a how to draw book and a sketchbook. And I sat in that sick bed and drew and drew and drew. And that really helped me to heal from the pneumonia, because I wouldn't have said it then because I didn't know the word, but I was really suffering from depression also, from the medications and from being ill so long. And it was a very difficult time physically, but also emotionally for me at age 9. And that drawing really brought me back to life, just that process of being able to create something on my own.
So from drawing, then where did you go?
Later on, I took art lessons at Otis Art Institute. They had a class for kids, and I took an art class there. And then when that class was closed, I was allowed to come into an adult class, and we were painting portraits. And I did that for the whole time I was in high school. And I did not enjoy high school at all, so Saturday art class saved me. That was the other sort of therapeutic use of art in my life, as well as, drawing when I was sick. And it's interesting that I'm sharing this with you because becoming an art therapist many years later is really no accident when I look back and see the roots of my deep connection with art was really having to do with healing. Right. Healing myself from a physical illness and healing myself during my teens when I was pretty unhappy. We moved 3 times we moved once, but I moved high schools 3 times in my teens, and that was really a hard transition. And those art classes were the sort of anchor, they were the solid continuity that kind of got me through high school, because every Saturday I went to art school. So no matter what else was going on, I could count on that, and that was very therapeutic for me.
Well, that happens with us. Our healing turns into the way that we heal others so often, which has been the case for me too. So then what, Lucia? What about college and all of that?
Well, it's interesting. My father encouraged me to become a writer because he could have gotten me into the Screenwriters Guild, which was very difficult to get into. And I had talent in writing, and my teachers were all saying, oh, you should think about being a writer. But I was taking those art classes, and I realized that that's where my heart was. So when it came time to decide about a degree in college, I decided to major in art. And at that time, it just so happened that the woman who would become my mentor, Sister Mary Carita was her name at the time, she was appearing in national magazines, on the cover of magazines and in feature stories. And that was just coincidental with the senior year decision-making process for me about where to go to college. And I happened to be going to that high school where she was teaching at the college. And even though I had been researching other colleges for art programs, when I saw those articles, I realized, I'd be a fool not to take advantage of this opportunity. So I decided to go to Immaculate Heart College and study with Sister Carita.
Which is where, Lucia?
Well, the college is no longer there. There is a high school still there that I went to, but it's in Hollywood.
Okay.
It kind of boasted some famous graduates, one of them being Mary Tyler Moore, the high school.
Wow.
Mary was in my graduating class in high school. A lot of movie stars' kids went there, but it was a really wonderful school because that order of nuns was extremely progressive. They later became very active in the inner city community. They were politically very involved, and they were very bright women and very progressive. And so it was a wonderful environment in terms of education and social consciousness, and it was just a great experience. I'm very grateful I went there.
So then from there, what happened next?
Well, it was in my freshman class with Sister Carita that I saw some Eames films, and I had never heard of him, didn't know who he was. I had seen his furniture around because he was just beginning to be quite famous in the 50s, but I didn't know who he was, and I saw the film, and having been raised in the movie industry, the film, all of the Eames films really caught my attention. And I remember going up to Sister Carita at the end of class and saying, who made those films? And she said, well, very famous furniture designer. She said, see that chair over there? And she pointed to one of those wire shell chairs that had just recently been released and is sort of an iconic piece of furniture now. And so she said, they're friends of ours, and that's their film. And she told me a little bit about them. And I said to her, I want to work for them someday. And she looked at me, and I said, what do I have to do? And she said, well, stay here for 4 years and work hard, do all the assignments, and then we'll talk about it. And I did exactly what she said. And after my junior year, I got a job first as a babysitter for his grandchildren who were visiting, and then I got a job at the Eames office doing any number of tasks that needed to be done, graphic design and painting murals and just doing all kinds of things. And it was an absolutely fantastic job. I just loved it. It was great. And I was there for a couple of years and worked on the 7-screen film presentation that went to Moscow during the cultural exchange in 1959, worked on a science exhibit for IBM, and some films that the Eameses were making, scientific and training films for IBM, and just lots of different kinds of projects. It was really exciting.
Then where does the Montessori part of your professional life come in?
Well, the Montessori and educator piece comes in. While I was working at the Eames office, I got a phone call from a teacher, actually she's a principal, at a school in the inner city. She was an Immaculate Heart sister, and she needed a replacement. She needed a full-time 4th grade teacher. And she called me on New Year's morning and asked me if I would like the job teaching there. And I thought there was some mistake because I explained to her that I had never taught and I had no training in education, and I certainly had no experience. And she said, it doesn't matter. You've come highly recommended.
Wow.
And it turned out that one of the women who had been in that community of nuns had been a friend of mine, and I had told her I was interested in maybe volunteering at one of the schools on a Saturday because I had recently gotten married and would like to have some experience with children. I was an only child. And so that information is sort of like the telephone game. It got misinterpreted over to this principal who now needed a 4th grade teacher.
Oh, my gosh.
And I said yes. I mean, I know that some higher power was working through me because it was not a rational decision on my part, and it really wasn't on the principal's part, considering that I had no training or education. But I transitioned into that job over a period of a week or two, and it turned out that the projects at the Eames office were all kind of coming to a halt, and so things were not real busy there. So the timing was pretty good. And I taught for one semester from the Christmas break to the summer when the semester ended. And I had an incredibly amazing experience working with these kids. Fourth graders, inner city, mostly Hispanic, some African American children, and a few Caucasian kids. And it was an amazing experience. I ended up teaching almost everything through art. And they really took to it. It worked for me. And all of their grades went up by the end of the year. So I knew I was doing something right. And the kids in the class won all 4 prizes in the all-city arts competition.
Oh, my gosh.
And they were competing with LA Unified. And they were competing with some schools that were very affluent, where they had special teachers and art studios and all that kind of stuff. And for my little kids in the inner city, that was a great deal. You know, they got prizes, and it was wonderful. So I ended that year pregnant and very satisfied with my experience teaching. And then, of course, when I had kids, I was very concerned about their education. And I started reading Montessori right away. Somebody gave me a book on Montessori, and I started reading that, and eventually took the Montessori training when my 2 daughters were already in Montessori schools. And so I was able to kind of experiment with Montessori's principles in my own home with my own children, and then go into work as a Montessori teacher. And that was the summer of '65 when Head Start began. And I was hired. It was very similar to that first teaching experience. I was hired with no administrative educational experience to run the Head Start program for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles.
Wow.
And that was, again, the good old Girls Network, the Immaculate Heart Sisters recommending me, and I got the job. I was protesting all the time, saying I wasn't qualified, but they thought otherwise, and I did the job, and everything worked out fine. Nobody was harmed.
Wow.
And the program was very highly evaluated. So I feel very fortunate about that experience.
So has that been a pattern of your life, to kind of find yourself in these situations where you feel unprepared, and has that happened many times?
Yes, it has happened quite a few times. I got a job at Mattel handed to me years later. Someone heard me speaking at a Montessori conference and from Mattel, and they hired me to develop a whole product line there. And you know, I really didn't think I was qualified, even though I had the design background, the early education background. And there were some bumps in the road because I didn't like the way they were field testing toys in a hermetically sealed room in their offices at the corporate headquarters. I thought that was totally unrealistic. So I had to tussle with them about how I was going to field test the toys I was designing. And I finally got permission from them to field test in nursery schools and in private homes with real children in real situations, you know, and not being ushered into a room and given a toy to play with, which is totally unreal.
Right, right.
But I think another pattern that has come out of all of this, and this certainly was true with the Head Start experience, because I was running a program with 300 children and 12 sets of staff and 12 centers. It was a big job. But one thing I learned was to really stick to my guns, listen to my heart, and really stand up for what I know to be true. And I had to do that in Head Start because our budget was ridiculously low for classroom equipment and furniture. I think it was $90, and I just laughed at it, and I gave my resignation because I said, you've hired me to do a job, and I can't do it with this budget from the federal government. And so the Archdiocese backed me up, and we went downtown and talked to the government officials about doing a cross-line transfer and putting the money into the classroom instead of all of the administrative salaries that they had earmarked. So that was a big lesson for me, you know, stand up for what you believe in.
And that's a brave
And I've
act,
always been rewarded
Lucia.
when I've done that.
Yeah. So then, okay, so now where does the interest in psychology come from?
Well, I think that was really there all along with the Montessori experience and studying child development and early education and studying her idea that people have an innate knowing about what they need to know and learn. And her whole method is based on that principle. And there's a lot of good psychology in that. And so I would say that my first experiences of the psychology of health in children had to do with Montessori. But my real inner crisis with that, and what led me into the field of art therapy, was my own illness. Again, a physical illness in 1973 when I was 35. And by this time, I was divorced and raising my two children. They were 7 and 8 when I divorced. And a couple of years after the divorce, I came down with a very mysterious condition. And I was really not functional. I was quite ill. And the doctors were misdiagnosing what I had. I found out years later what it was, but at the time they didn't really know. And I was taking medication and having side effects, and it was just a downward spiral. It was a terrible experience. And one day they got my lab tests mixed up with someone else's and called me and said, don't take that medication. It should have been given to somebody else. And I got so disgusted that I stopped taking the medication because I was already taking it and I was already having side effects. So I just got disgusted and I threw all my medicine out and went back to bed and just did some serious soul searching. What is working and what isn't here? And one thing I knew was that this journal that I had just started keeping at the beginning of that summer really made me feel better. Whenever I drew and wrote in my personal journal, dumped my feelings out, drew my dreams out that I was having at night, I felt better. And so I decided to just continue doing that. And I shared that journal with a friend who told me about her therapist. She said, I think you'd really love working with her. And I said, great. So that's what I did. I worked with her for 3 months, and that was fabulous. She was doing a combination of Gestalt therapy and transactional analysis and some energetic work, body work. And it was very successful. 3 months of that, plus my journaling, and I had turned my illness around. I was able to function again. And then I started sharing my journal with some other friends, and one of them said, you're doing art therapy here. You really should consider becoming an art therapist. You'd be perfect. You have your background in art. You have all this background in child development. You really should think about it. So I did look into art therapy, and I found an art therapist and worked with her as a client because I wanted to see what it was like from the client's perspective first before making any kind of a career decision. And the results were phenomenal. I had already gotten my physical health back, but now I was getting a deeper experience into my destiny and where my life was leading me. And it was very clear shortly into the art therapy with her that I really should consider this as a career option. And so I did. I got into a master's degree program through Goddard College, which at that time had a external degree program there in Plainfield, Vermont, and I was in California. And because of being a single parent and supporting myself, I really couldn't go to Vermont, but they did have an external degree program. So I signed up for that, and I got my master's in art therapy, and also then went on to become a registered art therapist with the American Art Therapy Association.
So, Lucia, if you don't mind, you mentioned transactional analysis. Can you just explain what that is?
Well, what I understood from TA was that we have these various states of being inside of ourselves.
Ego states.
That are always there. And one of them was the inner child. And that's our spontaneous, playful, and very emotional self. So it involves a lot of different feelings, and it also involves a way of looking at the world. So when I was in my inner child state in those sessions, and she would combine that with Gestalt therapy, so I'd move around the room and be in my inner child state, I realized how creative I was and also how emotional. And so that gave me a taste of a part of myself that in growing up I had kind of left behind to a certain degree. I had brought my creative child with me into adulthood, but I had not really honored my emotional child. And that was the part of me that was the one that would come in to make me ill and stop me from going on in business as usual. And I realized
Wait a minute.
that...
Pay attention to me. Was the message...
What?
You were getting the message.
The message was
Take
that
care of me.
the inner child... Yeah, the message was that the inner child had been ignored, and she had kind of gone on strike,
right.
Because I was pushing and stressing myself out and working really hard and being a grown-up and carrying responsibility, but that I had not been listening to her. And I had started listening to her in my journal, but when I got into therapy and the therapist showed me this part of myself, so she let it come out and have a voice, I realized very clearly that I had been stuffing that part of myself down, the vulnerable child, the angry child, and those are all emotional states that are very typical of early childhood. And so that was a real awakening for me. I also, in transactional analysis, learned that I had this critical parent inside that was really merciless. It was a perfectionist. It was a pusher. It was pushing me all the time.
Judgmental.
And I was never going to please it. It was always going to be dissatisfied, and there was no pleasing it. And I realized that had been pushing me to the point of illness. So the combination of this pusher and the child finally saying, I can't do this anymore, I'm going on strike, put me into that sick bed. And that all became clear when I got into transactional analysis with her.
So then between the art therapy and your journaling and your work in transactional analysis, and to begin to identify these ego states, then it seems pretty logical that would soon unfold into your recovery of your inner child, right? And so
exactly.
So then how did that relate to you writing the book?
Well, I wrote my first book because my students were demanding it. I was teaching a creative journal class for 6 weeks at the local YWCA. And that was right after I started my private practice in early 1976. And the first class I taught was a 6-week journal class. And the students were very excited about the class, and they were very excited about the comments that I made and the journal prompts that I was giving them. And I would give them these little, 1-page sheets with 3 or 4 prompts on them. And they said, you really should write a book about this and put these prompts into a book. And I continued teaching an advanced class and so on and so forth. So I was adding more prompts. And they were saying, yeah, you definitely are writing a book here. And I said, a book of journal prompts would be quite boring. What's exciting to me about the class is your journal work that you're sharing in here. So I would be willing to write a book if you would contribute some examples from your journals. And they all agreed. And so that was how the Creative Journal, my first book, was born, which is a series of journal prompts, some introductory text of mine, and then, of course, all their work. And that got me really started. The inner child work that was contained in that book really sparked people's interest. And I started getting a lot of private clients who wanted to know more about this inner child stuff with the art. So I started doing a lot of art therapy with people's inner child, and I would have them scribble and doodle. And of course, while I was in therapy, I had discovered my non-dominant hand and what could come out of that by writing and drawing with a non-dominant hand. And so I started doing that with my clients, and the results were phenomenal. It was way beyond anything I'd expected. The therapy moved very quickly. Some really major issues got resolved, and they were referring me to other clients, and it just spread from there. So that was how it all started. And then I wrote my second book, The Power of Your Other Hand, which incidentally is just being re-released again in its 3rd edition. And I had a whole chapter in that book called Recovery of the Inner Child. And when I went out to do workshops based on that book, that was the chapter that was the most popular. People really wanted to know more about that. they got a lot out of it. They would write me letters, and so I decided that that was going to be worth a whole book, and that was why I wrote Recovery of Your Inner Child, which came out in 1991.
So the power of the other hand, was it in your private practice and this art therapy that you were doing with your clients that you kind of discovered this?
Yes. Well, actually, I discovered it in my own therapy with my first therapist as a technique for getting people to experience their inner child. She did one thing, and one thing only, and that was have the client sit on the floor with a big pad of newsprint and write down with their non-dominant hand, printing what they would do that week to apply what they learned in the session. And that was the only way in which she used it, just that one technique, and to do it maybe once or twice in a series of 3 months of sessions. And that got me using the non-dominant hand in my journal. I just did that spontaneously. It wasn't anything she assigned, but because I was doing all this writing, one day I was doing a written piece in my journal, and my critic started coming into my head, and my left hand grabbed the pen out of my right hand and started sassing back to the critic. It was a little bratty kid, very assertive, and she just spoke up and said, stop putting me down. And it was amazing. When I was finished with that, and it was a dialogue back and forth between both hands, and when I was finished with that dialogue, I realized that I had found the key to breaking through creative blocks, because I saw that blocks are caused by this inner critic, stopping the creative inner child. And it just dawned on me that that's what I had discovered. It was amazing. It was like discovering a new continent. Yeah.
Well,
so that's become a distinguishing characteristic of my work, is this work with a non-dominant hand and the dialogues between the hands in written form, and then also drawing with a non-dominant hand.
Right. Yeah. And I'll tell you, having been through your workshops and then later on, I have become a member of ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholic and Dysfunctional Families, where, the term inner child is used a lot, and the tool of journaling with your non-dominant hand is really, really encouraged. And
yes,
especially in the last 3 to 5 years, I have gotten into the habit of recognizing when I need a cathartic experience, and have, developed the discipline of setting aside time to write with my non-dominant hand. And it is such an amazing experience. I mean,
well, the other big discovery for me, beyond the inner child coming through, was that I started experiencing another voice, and it always wrote in cursive, longhand, not printing. And it didn't look like a child's handwriting. It looked quite legible. It was very different, but it was still my non-dominant handwriting. And it was a voice of inner wisdom and comfort. And it was like having a wise sage there with me, giving me guidance about any problem that I was having in my life or any difficulty I was facing. And that was a real surprise, because I did not expect that kind of voice to come out of the same hand that was speaking for the inner child. But that's what happened, and that's been a huge discovery.
So do you think it would be fair to say that when the inner child is properly nurtured and well taken care of, that's when that voice of wisdom begins to emanate from the inner child?
Well, I don't think it's coming from the inner child. I think it's coming from a different place. It's a very wise voice. Sometimes it speaks almost in scriptural language. It sounds like a very universal voice. And this was an experience that I want to share with you that really told me how universal it was. I was leading a retreat at a Franciscan retreat center in California for 95 women recovering alcoholics. And it was an inner child weekend. And on the final day, Sunday afternoon, after they went to their 12-step meetings, we had our closing session. And in that session, I asked them to do a dialogue with their higher power and to ask their higher power for guidance in any area of their life where they felt confused or, challenged, etc. And then to switch the pen to their non-dominant hand. And this time, instead of asking for an inner child to speak, ask for their higher power to speak. And they wrote for quite a long time. At the end of the session, I opened the floor and had people come up to the microphone who wanted to share what they had written. And I want to tell you, Tom, there was not a dry eye in that house. Everybody was crying when they were hearing each other's sharing. And a few of them got up at the very end and said, this all sounds like the same voice coming through. Their voices were interchangeable. And they all agreed that, Mary Jane's higher power voice could just as well have been mine. And it was speaking to stuff that I'm dealing with. And it was really amazing. So then I realized for sure that we were tapping into a really deep and natural source of inner wisdom that we all carry inside. The other thing that really moved me about that weekend was that several of the women got up and said that this higher power experience taught them that their higher power was inside themselves. It was not outside as an external thing. That they carried this higher power inside themselves, and they had it with them at all times.
Well,
and they had not been clear about that before. But when they wrote it, they wrote this voice with their own hand. They knew they had it inside. And that was the real payoff for the whole weekend for me.
Well, and for me, in this day and age, you see in social media and really everywhere in popular culture, if you're paying attention, a lot of talk about self-love. And for me, to really be able to grasp that, learning that lesson about my creator being part of me and me being a part of it, I mean, it opened doors for me to be able to love myself in a way that I never really could before. So just that recognition in and of itself is such a healing thing. It really is.
Exactly. Yeah. And when I wrote The Power of Your Other Hand, I decided to let my non-dominant hand have the last word. And so there is a dialogue in which my non-dominant hand does most of the writing at the end of the book. And that was really coming from my higher wisdom. And it started, the non-dominant started by saying, just say that the deepest well of inner knowing and of peace is within everyone. It can be reached in stillness, in quiet, and in solitude. I am here in everyone and everything, and the glory of being human is that you can know and experience at one moment with me. Wow. It was really a mind blower when I read that back to myself. And at the very, very end of the dialogue, which is the close of the book, there were some words that I have never forgotten and that have kind of informed my life and my work since then. And it said, the highest truth and wisdom resides within you. Everything else is illusion. You will see that you've had it backwards all these years. You thought yourself was the little scared, confused character that doubts and worries and defends itself. That is the figment of imagination. That is the thing you made up with your mind. I am the real you. I am your true self, reminding you to wake up, come home to the bliss of your inner self.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And that's really what I've been trying to do all these years with my books, workshops, trainings, is really to give people tools to wake up and come home to the bliss of their inner self, their true self. And it's been a deeply rewarding journey for me to have this ministry. I really consider it a ministry, to be able to share these tools with people and, of course, use them myself.
Well, and, in our culture, we're so focused on things, and there's oftentimes such an atmosphere of scarcity. There won't be enough. That I know for me, and one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast is because this is part of who I really am. And when I was young, I was kind of discouraged from being who I really was. I mean, that, it might sound a little dramatic, but the things that I wanted to do, the people around me were afraid that I wouldn't be able to provide for myself. And they projected their fear onto me. And, I was at a place in my life where I didn't have a strong ego. I didn't have a lot of self-esteem. So I was easily influenced by all of that. And then the suffering, much of the intense suffering that I've experienced in my life, I now see as originating from my deviation from my true self.
I agree. I think whenever we do that, we suffer. Absolutely. I would agree with you. And, in my visioning work, I have really learned lessons from observing my students. I wrote the book Visioning in the early 90s about using magazine photo collage to create the image you want. That became very popular years later with the book The Secret. And I didn't invent that collage approach. It had been floating around in unity churches and Church of Religious Science for a long time. But as an artist, I had used storyboards. I had worked on animated films. And that's something that we do in filmmaking and lots of arts, where you create a visual storyboard. That goes way before any of the Unity Church treasure map workshops were going on in the 70s. So I was totally comfortable with this idea of visioning through pictures what you want to manifest. Of course, architects do that. Designers do it. I mean, that's what we did for a living as designers. But what I added to it, because I knew there were blocks, I added the journaling piece. And the journaling with the creative inner child, journaling with the critic who stands in the way and says, no, you can't have this dream. That's too crazy. It's too impractical, and you can't be living doing that. Or that, that's just beyond your scope. Who do you think you are? And that voice comes in and blocks people from listening to their heart's desire. So when I do these workshops, and certainly I spell this out in the book, I tell people, right now, you're just going to go for your heart's desire and put that out as you go through these magazines. And it is not about collecting stuff. It's about what state do you want to experience? What experiences do you want to have? That's what you're illustrating. And then we do the journaling, and we dialogue with the images. What are they saying? What part of you, it's like working with dreams. What part of you does that image represent? What kind of strength are you going to get from that? Whether it's a person or a place or a thing or whatever it is. And then working with the inner critic and finding out, what is your critic saying about all this? And then you answer back and tell it to shut up. Tell it you're not going to put up with this, that you are going to follow your heart, and that's it. And the amazing thing that happens is that when people do the journaling in conjunction with their vision collage, they develop the skill to do exactly what we're talking about, to really follow their heart in spite of internal and external criticism from others, either way. And the external criticism only works if we're criticizing ourselves.
So
You know,
I'm one of
we
the,
have to start there with the inner critic.
right. And
Yeah.
you know, one of the things I have come to believe is that for me, I believe that inner critic, you know, he kind of got all of his ideas from the outer critic. You know, that's where
right.
it started.
Right.
And then, you know, even if the outer critics, you know, stop their chirping, I don't need them anymore because my inner critic has taken that all on. And you mentioned one of those messages that, you know, I've come to learn has been really, really big for me, a huge obstacle. And that's, who do you think you are?
Yeah. Right.
Which is a killer. I mean, how can anyone do anything great in this world if they're asking themselves, who do you think you are?
Right. Right. Exactly. And I really experienced that when I wrote my first book, because my critic was jumping in and creating a writer's block. I was paralyzed for 3 weeks. I have that story in the Creative Journal book. At the back of the book, I tell the whole story because I want people to know you wouldn't have this book in your hands if I hadn't learned to sass back to my critic. Because my critic was coming in when I thought, after 3 weeks of no writing, just sitting at the desk staring into space, I took my journal out and I did this exercise, and it only took 2 pages. So I wrote down what the critic said. You know, you're no author, you can't write. Look at the stuff you've written. Blah, 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 you know.
Who wants to read that?
Yeah, and then I put the pen. Oh, and of course it told me no publisher's ever going to publish this.
Right.
You're wasting your time, right?
Right.
That's the other, you know, real killer line from the critic. You're wasting your time. You know, you'll never succeed.
Mm-hmm.
So when I put the pen in my other hand, my inner child just sassed back and said, you know, I'm doing it anyway, you know. And basically, I was showing up at the desk and putting the time in. So even though I hadn't written anything, at least I had been true to my commitment. And by the end of that dialogue, my inner child said, you're wasting your time. And I went down to my desk and started writing, and I finished that book in 3 months.
Wow.
And I was only working, you know, a couple of days, 2-3 days a week, because I was a single parent working almost full time. And, you know, I didn't have that much time. But in 2 to 3 weeks a week, 2 to 3 days a week, I finished that in 3 months, and I found a publisher pretty quickly. So, see, my critic was completely wrong. And it just was, you know, something that I had to see through. I call it the emperor with no clothes. You know, that critic is always going to tell lies.
Right.
And we learn. You're correct. We learned those lies from outside, and then we tape recorded them in our heads, and we keep playing them back to ourselves. And this tool really helps people to stop the tape. Okay, what's on it? Let's look at it. Let's examine it, and then let's answer back.
Well, and here's another lesson that I've learned that relates to this, because there is the inner critic for me which, you know, tells me, you know, you don't have anything good to write. Nobody wants to hear what you have to say. But then there's also the inner wisdom that has slowed me down, because what I needed to write, I wasn't ready to write yet. And I needed to learn the lessons I needed to learn in order to really convey the message that is most me, that is what I'm really supposed to write.
That's very important. I discovered that with my second book, The Power of Your Other Hand. I met a publisher in the early 80s who said, you know, what are you going to write next? This is after the Creative Journal was out. And I told him about this non-dominant hand stuff. And he said, oh, that sounds great. Why don't you write a book about that? And I said, yes, I intend to. And he solicited a proposal. He said, yeah, I'd be interested. And I asked him. And I sent it in, and he rejected it. And I won't go into all the details, but, you know, it was just crazy. I don't know that he really read the proposal that much, but I gave him 2 sample chapters and a table of contents. And anyway, he turned it down. And so then I continued working on it. And I got really blocked, and I had to have more dialogues with my inner critic, and I had to teach more classes and experiment more with the techniques. And long story short, the book was finally published several years later. But I realized when it was published that there was a lot of spiritual growth that I had gone through and had to go through before I was able to complete that book.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no hothousing that. You're either ready or you're not.
Right.
And I really wasn't ready at that point spiritually to finish that book. And I was very deeply grateful that, fate had created it so that I did not write that book earlier, because it would have been a different book. It certainly wouldn't have been as deep a book as it is, and it wouldn't have contained a lot of stuff that had to do with spiritual development, because I wouldn't have been there yet.
Yeah, and for me that has been a painful lesson, because specifically I've had in my head for a long time that there's a book. I got to write a book. I got to write a book. I got to write a book. This judgment and the inner critic and shame because I haven't done it yet. And, I carried this stuff around for so long and grappled with it for a long time until I came to that realization that, this is okay. I'm going to write it when the time is right, and I don't need to judge myself anymore. I need to be patient with myself and allow the process to unfold rather than try to force it, because forcing it never works either.
Right. And if it's coming from the critic and the pusher who are telling you should do this, and
then nobody will want to read it.
No. It would be a horrible book. It would be totally boring, and you wouldn't enjoy writing it, and what's the point? Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The creative child is the one that we really have to pay attention to when we're going to really take on a creative project. The child has to be on board. And if he or she is not, it's not going to happen.
To Authenticity proudly supports the I Speak Media Foundation, advancing media literacy education through an evolving series of outreach programs within the communities that need it most. For more information, visit ispeakmedia.org. There you have it, Lucia Capacchione. Check her out. I'll leave a link for her Amazon profile in the show notes. And look forward to part 2 of the episode. Not sure exactly which one that'll be, but it'll come out within the next week or two. I appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed the episode, if you enjoyed the show, please take the time to leave a rating or a review at Apple Podcasts. Subscribe, like, follow, whatever it lets you do, wherever you listen. And if you're not on Clubhouse, give it a shot. There's a link in the show notes. I'm doing a show at noon Eastern, Monday through Friday. Here and there, I might have a scheduling conflict and I might do it at 1 p.m. or sometimes I might not be able to do it, but for the most part, I'm doing it Monday through Friday. And as I go on, I'm committed to doing it Monday through Friday, but it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment for me professionally to be able to carve out that time. I'm also going to be doing a little bit of traveling, which that'll inhibit me a little bit, but please check it out. The Path to Authenticity on Clubhouse. I want to thank the show's sponsors, The Manor and Windrose Recovery. Thank you to Wendy Chin at Equivox, as always, for her digital support. Visit thepathtooauthenticity.com. Check out the blog posts, back episodes. Thank you to the band Punk Rock Opera, whose music you hear throughout the show. Their songs are used with permission from the artist and under a Creative Commons license. So I really appreciate you guys investing the time in me and in this show. Thanks for your support. Hope you have a great week. Be nice.
Hey, we need a guitar player.
This episode was brought to you by Equivox. For digital marketing or web design services, visit equivox.com.